It's on.
Edit. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And
Good morning.
thank you all for being here. It's really an incredible privilege for me to be able to share my experiences with you, and I will tell you it's an incredible joy. I had forgotten, I did speak last year, and I had forgotten how incredibly joyful it is to be around people who get it. It really, as you all know, I mean, it's a remarkable thing. When you've had a near-death experience, someone asked me yesterday what the negatives are. And we all talk about how great it is, how beautiful it is, how wonderful, blah, blah, blah. And it's a question I've never been asked. And I am quite sure that all of you who've had an experience can appreciate what I'm about to say. And the negative that I could identify was that it's a very lonely experience. It's a very isolating experience. And so it is so much fun not to have to talk about the background, not to have to feel like I'm alone. So thank you. It's really a privilege. And many of you were here last year, and many of you have heard my story. And hopefully today I'll touch on some aspects that maybe I didn't talk about last time. And I plan to go through things and probably skip over some things that I did talk about and leave quite a bit of time at the end for questions, because I feel like it's that question period of time that really allows us to talk about the things that you in this room today really care about and really want to hear about. So forgive me if I skip over things you thought I would talk about. You can bring it up during the question session. But my experience began in 1999 when my husband and I decided to go to Chile, a town in southern Chile that is an area well known for kayaking. And my husband and I are avid kayakers. We've kayaked for many, many years. We've kayaked across the country. This is something that was one of our passions, and I might add, still is one of our passions. And at that time, we had 4 young children. My youngest son was about a year old, and we felt that it was finally time that we could leave the country by ourselves. And any of you with kids can certainly appreciate the watershed moment when we thought, oh, yes, actually time together. That was really it's going to be a treat. Friends of ours spend their winters in Chile kayaking and running trips. They bring down American clients. And so this was not something new. This was not something out of the ordinary, and they were very dear friends of ours. So we went to Chile and had a wonderful week of kayaking. And on what was going to be our final day of kayaking anyway, we had decided to paddle on a section of river that's well known for its waterfalls. And when I talk about waterfalls, I'm talking about things that are reasonable, 15 to 20 foot drops. These are not, Niagara Falls. We're not going over in a barrel. It's not something that is out of the realm of reasonable kayaking for someone who is experienced. If you're not experienced yet, it would be a little crazy. So we had planned on going on the section of river, and that morning my husband actually woke up with back pain, which is not something he'd had before and hasn't had since. But that morning I woke up with back pain, and so he did not go on the river with us. I went on the river with, again, these friends of ours who are professional boaters. They own a raft and kayak company. This is what they do for a living. And then there were a couple of other Americans. And we went down the river and went over the first couple drops, and that was fine. And we came to the first significant drop, and it was early in the day, and so we sort of pulled out into an eddy at the side of the river and talked about how we were going to run it, and had decided that we were going to run through a smaller, sort of more minor chute or gap because the flow was a little bit less and we're still kind of getting it going for the day. And so I pulled out in the current, and I don't know how many of you all kayak, but this was a very high flow, high volume river. And once you're in the current, you're not turning around and paddling back up. This is a commitment, which is one of the things that I actually like about kayaking and kayaking challenging rivers is that it requires absolute focus, precision, skill, etc. And so I was out in the current and heading for the smaller chute, and the person who had preceded me had bobbled it a bit and ended up sideways in this drop, and it was a fairly narrow little chute, and so her boat was pinned. And she was able to then pull her spray skirt off, that neoprene fabric that spans the distance between a kayaker's body and the deck of the boat, keeping the water out. She was able to pull that off, push herself out of the boat, and she was flushed downstream. But the problem with the river is if there's something across it, it's a strainer. And what that means is it's like a colander. You know, you put the pasta in the water and the water flows through and the pasta stays. So on a river, if you're going into that situation, you become the pasta, which is not a good thing. And so in general, that's the type of situation you avoid. So I didn't really have many options, in fact none. And so I veered over and went over the main flow, the main part of the waterfall. And as I went over the top, I have to say I sort of groaned internally and looked at it and I thought, oh man, because there was tremendous volume going over this particular drop or this waterfall, and I couldn't see a clean outflow. And I thought at the top of this that what would happen is that I would hit the bottom, immediately flip upside down. I assumed that I wouldn't be able to right myself because of the turbulence and because of the volume, and I assumed that I'd pull my spray skirt off, push myself out of the boat, get tumbled around, and spit out downstream. And that is an experience that is never pleasant. It's not fun. It's not the good part of kayaking. But it would not have been the first time that I had been tumbled around in a rapid. That is part of kayaking. And unfortunately, it's probably not the last time either, but we all like to think that that won't happen at least. But nonetheless, that's what I assumed would happen. And I certainly didn't think about drowning. I certainly didn't think about that. But I hit the bottom, sort of preparing myself for this several minutes of misery before I popped up downstream. But instead what happened is I rocketed down and the front end of the boat became pinned in the rocks and the underwater features. And I and the boat were immediately and completely submerged under 8 or 10 feet of water that was cascading down. And the weight and the force of the current absolutely pressed my body to the front deck of the boat. And I am a spine surgeon. I am a very even-tempered, calm person. I'm very used to high-stress situations. You know, perhaps I relish them, I'm not sure. But regardless, I didn't panic. Many people have thought, oh my gosh, you must have just absolutely panicked. But no, I'm not a panicky kind of person. So I immediately set about to do those things that would either free the boat from whatever was catching it or free me from the boat. But the force of the water was such that I couldn't pull my hand back half of an inch, let alone pull my spray skirt off and push myself out. I was absolutely stuck. And I am a very concrete thinking, pragmatic sort of a person. I knew how far from shore I was. I knew my predicament. I've seen people die on the river before, and I knew that the likelihood of someone coming and saving me was as close to zero as it could be without being zero. And it was at that point in time that I made the first choice in a sequence of choices that I believe changed my life forever. And at that point in time, I didn't ask God to come and save me. I didn't ask any of that. I asked that God's will be done. And the reason I think that changed my life is because it was the first time in my life I actually meant it. And I think that most people who have ever asked for God's will to be done, or who have ever prayed the Lord's Prayer, probably is just like I was. You know, I grew up going to Sunday school, and I took my kids to church, and I've said the Lord's Prayer, I don't really know, but certainly hundreds or thousands of times. And in that prayer, of course, you ask for God's will to be done. But I was a very self-confident, highly educated person. I mean, I had my life under control. And when I asked that God's will be done, when I said that prayer, I asked the same way most of us do, which is I want God's will to be done as long as it's pretty much in line with what I think should be done. And on my timetable, of course. But when I was underwater, I really meant it. I asked that God's will be done, whatever that meant. And that's what I mean when I say it was the first time I really meant it. And at that moment, everything changed. I was immediately overcome with a very physical and real sensation of being held and comforted and reassured that everything was fine. My husband would be fine, my young children would be fine, and it was that word fine, not great, but fine. They would be fine regardless of whether I lived or died. And this was the first of many remarkable and profound parts of this experience for me, because I knew that I was being held by Christ. And it's not something I talked about for a long time because it seems very presumptuous. You know, why me? But one of the profound aspects of that was that I knew that Christ would be there holding anyone who asked. And it was such an intense experience because it was as though many of you have had the experience of having a little baby and just pouring your love into that baby and everything you are and all of your hopes and dreams and everything you are. And in this situation, I was that baby. And Christ was just filling me, pouring his love into me. And it was remarkable. And my little thought balloon off to the side, because I was still me. And I am a fairly cynical and skeptical person. My little thought balloon was looking at this thinking, oh, that's really kind of weird. That's strange. But I thought, okay, well, let's just see where this goes. And I then was taken through a life review, and it was not what I expected. I can't say that I ever had thought about death in the sense of what it would be like for me. During my training, my career, I certainly have been around death. I have certainly thought about death as it relates to other people. But I can't say I ever really spent much time thinking about my own death or what that process might be like. If I had thought about a life review, I probably would have thought about the Hollywood version of your life, flashing before your eyes, and you look at some things and you think, yeah, I was really good there. And then there are other times when you think, I could have been better there. But for me, it wasn't like that at all. Actually, it was so far removed from anything that I would have expected. That even now when I think about it, I think, wow, I couldn't have made it happen. Because it was the most remarkable thing. We did go through my life, and we looked at events in my life that in any other situation I would have described as sad or bad or challenging or horrible, all sorts of words like that. Recognizing that those are judgments that I've put on them. And then I had the most incredible experience of seeing the impact of a given event, not 2 or 3 or 4 times removed, which we can all understand. You have a bad day at work, you go home, you yell at your husband, and then they're mean to the kid, and the kid, is mean to the dog, that whole sequence. We can certainly understand the impact within our own little world of events. And in fact, when we look at events that occur elsewhere. We similarly really evaluate those events based on how it impacts us, our world, our view of the world, our emotional state. But I had this incredible privilege of seeing how an event impacted other people in the world 25, 30, 35 times removed. And to say it was profound really is not giving it its due credit, because what it showed me very clearly and very concretely, which again, I told you, I'm a concrete thinking person. I need to actually hold an apple. I am the Thomas that has to put their finger in the hole. But what it showed me very concretely is that, again, this idea that things are good or bad the idea is entirely in our own mind. It's our own judgment. Because the fact is, there really is beauty that comes out of every event. Albeit, usually we can only appreciate it retrospectively. And most of the time we'll never appreciate it, because we don't have the ability to see those 25, 30, 35 times removed impacts. And part of our evaluation of something when it comes to being good or bad really has to do with a desire to judge it, and a desire to say, well, was that worth it? Because we want to decide whether something that has hurt us or made us sad, or someone we love has gone on. We want to be able to say, well, I don't think that was worth it. Or, okay, now I get it. Oh, okay, I'm okay with it then. But having the ability to see events in my own life and see their impact totally changed the way I experience every event. So that was a pretty remarkable thing. And again, my thought balloon was thinking, okay, I know that I have been underwater too long to still be alive, but I feel more alive than I've ever felt. I knew that I wasn't hallucinating. I kept doing self-assessment exams. I kept thinking, okay, let me just take a moment and try to look at myself from afar, and am I screaming? Am I upset? I'm just not recognizing it. So I was having this dialogue with myself, and I could still feel the water. I could still feel the current working on my body. I could feel my body being sucked out of the boat. And at one point, I could feel my body coming out of the boat. I could feel my knees bending backwards on themselves, and yeah, that was creepy. I saw that expression, yeah. I mean, I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I could tell, I thought, that doesn't feel good. That, I could feel the ligaments tearing and the bones breaking, and I still felt absolutely wonderful. Had no pain. And as my body came over the front deck of the boat, I could feel my spirit peeling away from my body, sort of like peeling apart two pieces of tape. And eventually my body broke free from the boat, and my spirit rose up and out of the river. And this is an example of a time when it's so wonderful to talk to people who get it. Because the magnificence of and the intensity of this joy of just having the water fall away from me and rising up was just, as you know, indescribable. I mean, it was incredible. And so I rose up and out of the river, and I was immediately greeted by a group of somethings, people, spirits, beings. I'm never quite sure what name to give them, because those words mean different things to different people, but they were people I had known forever, and I knew that they had known me for as long as I had existed. And they were so absolutely overjoyed to see me and welcome me and greet me, and I knew that they were there to guide me. I knew they were there to protect me, and I just couldn't believe it. I was absolutely overcome with a sense of being home, which again is it's so much fun to say that in a group of people who get it. I mean, I was finally home, and I was going to sleep in my own bed, and it was great. And I was surprised by that, because again, in my experience, I was still me. I was still my personality, my cynical self, really. And I was thinking, this is nuts. But I was really surprised by that sense of being home, and I was really surprised by my ability to look back at the river and see what was going on. And of course, there was this shift in time dimension. I don't know what the right words are to describe that, but of course, time and dimension really lost all meaning. And so I was able to be celebrating with these people and simultaneously watch the guys pull my body to the shore and start CPR. And I recognized my body as mine. I recognized it as my life, that it represented my husband, my 4 young children. And I was really surprised by the fact that I wasn't going back. And I was not a person who was trying to escape something. I had a great life. I still have a great life. I had a great job. I had a husband that not only loved me, but I loved dearly. And I had 4 young children that I loved more than I could ever imagine loving something on earth. I had a great life, and I had every reason to come back. But I had no intention of coming back. Now keep in mind, I mean, people have oftentimes asked me, well, didn't you feel guilty? And I like to say, keep in mind that I had already been reassured by Christ that they would be fine. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. But I was really surprised by that. And so I said, okay, well, that's all good, but they're taking me. And we started down this path toward this great dome structure of sorts, and I'll try to be a little more concrete, because a lot of people have asked, well, what was it actually like? And for me, I will say that it was so incredibly beautiful. It was this path was an actual, seemed like a physical path, like a road, but everything else was limitless. It wasn't like it was a hallway. It was an incredible expanse. And I absolutely believe that God speaks to each of us in the way that we will understand, and sends us most gentle messengers to come and collect us. And what speaks to me, what truly moves my soul, is color and flowers and aromas, the aromas of flowers. And that's not true for everyone. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why when people talk about NDEs, they say, oh, well, they're not all the same. But I would say, for example, when it comes to beauty, they are all the same. So many people talk about intense beauty, albeit different beauty. I like the mountains, I don't like the desert. Other people like the desert. I mean, it's a different beauty. So what speaks to me is color, for example. And this pathway, these people, this hall was absolutely exploding with the essence of color. I could see and experience and feel and taste every color of the rainbow and more, all at the same time. And it didn't make brown. It was an understanding of every color. And the intensity was, of course, beyond anything we see here. I mean, the colors here, the feelings here are so pale in comparison. And flowers everywhere, and intense flowers. And again, the flowers, the aromas, as so many of you can understand, it was though I understood the aroma. I was part of the aroma. I was part of all of it, and it was all part of me. And everything was infused with an absolute, pure, unconditional love of God. And it was all-encompassing. And so we were going down this pathway, and I knew that this, and I don't really have the words to describe it, of course, but this great dome structure of sorts was really the point of no return. And I could hardly wait, because I wasn't going back. So, running, like, come on, guys, let's go. And one of the guys who was doing CPR was a young man at the time. He was 18, and he kept calling to me to come back, which I might add is exactly opposite of what you're taught to do during emergency resuscitations. Really, in training, you're taught to just divorce yourself from the individual. You just go through the protocols, you keep doing them until they either work or don't. But he was never able to do that. And he kept calling to me to come back and take a breath. And calling and calling and calling. And I would look back, and he was kind of a fluffy guy. A very soft, vulnerable kind of a kid. And I would look back, and eventually I would just think, okay. And I would say, okay, hang on, I'll be right back. And I would go back down to the river, and I would quickly lie down, take a breath, and then immediately I'd be back with these people. And then he would start calling, and I would look back and I'd think, oh my gosh, really? Okay. And I would go back and take a breath. And this cycle went on a number of times. And it was interesting to talk to him later, because I was really irritated. And it was interesting to talk to him because he was really irritated, because I would take a breath and then stop. And then eventually I would take a breath. And I joked afterwards, I said, well, you only asked for one breath. I told you several times now, I am a concrete thinking person. If you ask me for a breath, I interpret that as one. So eventually we did get a little bit further down, and we eventually arrived at this threshold, and I could see other angels, people, I'm not sure what to call them, inside, and everyone was very busy, and everyone was so overjoyed to welcome my arrival. And it was amazing because, again, it wasn't me. I knew that that same sense of joy occurred when every person showed up. It was this remarkable recognition, because there's so many of us, and a lot of people die every day. But it was clear that every single soul actually makes a difference. And I was on this threshold for what seemed like, of course, many, many hours. And I, like so many of you, felt that I had complete understanding. I understood how it all worked. I listened to a gal talk yesterday who said something that I thought, oh my gosh, that's it. She had the same experience. Because she said it all made sense. Everything was in order. And I would say that that was part of my experience. All I had to do was think about a question, and it all made sense. I understood how it worked. And it was remarkable for me in many aspects, one of which was understanding, although of course I can't verbalize it, but truly understanding how it can be true that God actually knows each and every one of us, loves each and every one of us as though we're the only ones, and has a plan for each and every one of our lives that's wonderful. And that was really, not that the rest of it wasn't profound, but this was a very profound understanding for me, because it's something with which I had struggled before this experience. There are billions of us on the planet. I mean, you look around this room, It's pretty difficult to even know everyone in a given room. It's very difficult to know the people in your neighborhood, to love them, to accept them despite the fact that you don't like them. They don't look like you, they don't agree with you, whatever the reason. Our general approach is exclusionary. You know, we like only who we like, and they get to be in our club and no one else does. But to realize that God loves each and every one of us more intensely than we have any ability to understand or comprehend, and has a plan for each one of us. I mean, that's incredible. The topic of this conference, hope, healing, and life transformations. If that isn't something for which to be hopeful, there's nothing. I mean, the idea that God knows me and loves me more than I can appreciate it. You know, the Bible says that nothing can come between us and God's love, but I would disagree with that. I think the one thing that can come between that is us. I don't feel worthy of that love. I don't understand that love, and so I can't accept it. So, I was on this threshold, and we're having a great time. And then, of course, the people, these angels, spirits, guides, whatever you want to call them, then told me that it wasn't my time, that I had more work to do on earth, and that I had to go back to this body that I'd already said goodbye to. And so I did what I thought was reasonable. I said, I'm good. No, everything's fine. I'm not going back. I'm here. I lost that argument. I'm a doctor, not a lawyer. So I was very sad to then be taken back down this path. And at that time, as part of the conversation, I was told about some of the things I still had to do on earth. And at that time, we had the first of a couple of conversations about some of those things, including the future death of my oldest son. And at that time, in the conversation, part of it, of course, was, well, what's that about? Why? And again, it went back to this life review that I had. And recognizing that mine and ours, our position is not to ask why. Our responsibility is not to know the answer and to make that judgment of whether something is worth it or not. But our responsibility is to trust and to say, yes, God's will be done. And trust that there is beauty that will come of all things. And that there is hope in the plan for each person's life. So with that then, I was taken back to my body, and I lied down and was then reunited with my body. And there I was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, southern Chile in 1999, and even today I might add, but southern Chile in 1999 had nothing. I mean, barely any people, no medical services, no ambulances, nothing. And it was a long series of events that eventually got me back to Wyoming for my medical care, because I had decided I was going home. And I've been asked many times, are you kidding? What, like, you went back to Wyoming? I mean, I had multiple broken bones, torn ligaments. I had a horrific case of ARDS, or pulmonary. It's a shock reaction, really. And it's the part of the story I don't really like to talk about that much because it made sense to me, but in large part it's nonsensical. The people we were with have always looked to us, meaning my husband and I, for their medical care. And I didn't care if I lived or died. In fact, well, I did care. I didn't really want to be here. And so I couldn't have cared less if I died en route. So it was easy for me. I said, no, I'm going home. And my husband was in an absolute state of shock, of course, and I'm sure wasn't thinking at all. And he had not been on the river with me, and so I don't really think he quite understood what had happened. So I said, I'm going home, and nowhere during this process was there any person who looked at us and said, no, this is ridiculous. You can't do this. So we actually, my husband carried me on his back, and we actually got on a commercial flight and flew home. And that involved a series of miracles. But then we were home, and I was in the ICU. And when I was in the ICU, I still had no pain, absolutely no pain, despite all these injuries. And I really felt like I was neither here nor there. I kind of felt like, some people describe it as a veil between this world and God's world. I tend to think about more in terms of dimensionality. If we lived in a two-dimensional world and we were all dots and lines and squares and circles, we would have no ability to recognize that we were actually living within a cube. Because we couldn't see a cube, we don't even have the language for a cube, we don't even know what a cube is. And I tend to see it like that. And so it wasn't that I was going back and forth, but my focus on the spiritual world was sort of coming in and out. And during the first couple of weeks when that was happening, I felt like I went back and forth a couple of times, and how you describe that is different. I mean, I'll say that they were out-of-body experiences, but I'm not really sure that that's quite the right way. But there are a number of things that happened during that time, one of which is that friends of mine brought in great magazines to read. I mean, the hospital was really boring. And I was in the ICU, which meant that I didn't even have people to talk to most of the time. And there's activity 24 hours a day, so of course you never sleep. And they brought in magazines, and I thought, great, all, kayaking, cross-country skiing, all this stuff. And I tried reading them, and everything was blurry. I couldn't see anything. I could see, but everything was blurry. I couldn't have a conversation for more than a couple of seconds because I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't watch TV. I couldn't do anything. And I was really frustrated. And so eventually I thought, oh, for heaven's sakes. Anyone have a Gideon's Bible? I thought, I've seen those for my whole lifetime. I always wondered who read them. And I found out it was people like me. But I got this Gideon's Bible, and I looked for passages about, something, give me strength, or something like that. And everything was blurry. Couldn't read a thing. And just as I was about to toss it aside, a verse became crystal clear. Rejoice always. Okay, it's a little odd. I had been what I thought was a, quote, happy person, which of course is very different from being joyful. And over the course of the day, the subsequent verses became clear, and the verses were, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, and give thanks in all circumstances. That was it. That's all I could read for several days. It was remarkable. And so I thought about those verses pretty much 24 hours a day because there's nothing else to do. And as I thought about those, and I tried to think about why these verses were clear and nothing else was, I realized that in large part, if you spend your life abiding only in those three verses, you'd be pretty well off. Because the fact is, if we live a life of gratitude, it changes the way we experience life. And if we live a life of gratitude in constant prayer, constant communication, constantly open to the supernatural presence of God, then it's easy to live a life that's filled with joy. And as I was contemplating this, and also contemplating everything else I had been told, I found myself back in what I would describe as heaven. And I was in this absolutely beautiful, endless, sun-drenched field. And again, for me, it's the colors and the sensory input. And it was sort of that late afternoon sun when it's so beautiful. The lighting is just fantastic. And I was sitting on the ground and having a little chit chat with Christ. And Jesus was sitting on this rock, and again, it's not something I talked about for a long time, because it seems, first of all, very presumptuous, pretentious, but in addition to that, very personal. It was it was my thing. When I first started telling about my experiences to people, like I'm sure many of you, there's sort of this mixed bag. I had been given a mandate to share my experiences, and I was willing to say yes, sort of. But I didn't want to share everything, because I wanted something just for me. And I've talked to many, many people. I've listened to probably 400 or 500 people's near-death experiences now, and it's interesting because that's a very common experience for people. They don't want to share it with anyone because it's sort of their special little experience, their special connection. So I didn't really talk about it much, but I had this conversation, again, for what seemed like many hours with Christ, and we did talk more about some of the things I still had to do. And we talked about this mandate to share my experiences, which it's not something I ever would have signed up for. It's sort of like, well, why do I have to do that? I don't like it. I'm not good at it. You're wrong. But here I am, of course. And we also talked about, again, my future son's death. And during that conversation, yet again, came back to the very original experience during my life review. And again, talked about this transformation from a hope or a faith that the promises of God are true to an absolute trust. Because if you make that transformation, it is absolutely life-changing. It's an absolute game changer. Because if you come to a point when you don't just say, well, yeah, I think it's all true. But if you actually come to a point where you say, I know that God is real and present. I know that He loves me more than I can appreciate. And I know that God has a plan for my life that is one of hope. Then it changes the way you experience events. It changes the way you experience every moment of every day. So we did talk more about that. And then I was back in my hospital bed. And I pushed my nurse's button and said, I want to know what drugs I'm getting. Because I want more of those. And what I was told then, and indeed after the fact, I went back and I've gone through all my medical records, and I wasn't getting anything. I wasn't getting anything other than antibiotics. And early on, I'd been given steroids. And so I wasn't receiving any drug that would create a hallucination. And so then after the first couple weeks, then I started to be less in the spiritual world, more in this world. Then I did start having pain, plenty of it. And had multiple surgeries, many, many months of rehab. And during those many months of rehab, I spent a lot of time and a lot of effort trying to figure out what it was that had happened to me. Maybe if I'd known about this group then, it would have saved me some time. But at the time, I went through all my medical records, I went through all the data I could, I listened to what everyone had to say who had been at the river, in the emergency room, in the hospital. I collected as much data as I possibly could. And then also did research. I looked at the idea of hallucinations, and that was easy to discount that. Because of course hallucinations or dreams are very short-lived. First of all, it's a very different quality of experience. It's a very different memory. As you all know, and as every person who's ever told me their story would say, I remember the details of my experience as accurately and precisely as today as I did when it was happening. And I think it's as though we describe the event in real time. It's a present tense for us. It's not just recalling a memory. I mean, I remember big events in my life pretty well. But if I describe them year after year, 50 years into the future, the details will probably change a little bit. But near-death experiences, as you know, are different. The details don't change. It's a different quality of experience. So then I thought, okay, well, let's look into the physiologic effect of a dying brain. What does DMT do? What is the process? Because that's a reasonable explanation. And so I looked at the research, and I think that it's a handy explanation for people who have hypoxia of maybe a couple of minutes. And so I looked at the timetable of my experience, and the people who resuscitated me, and keep in mind that this is what they do. They are professionals. They're very in tune with time. They would say I was without oxygen for 30 minutes. And within that 30 minutes were 7 minutes or so of time that they didn't realize I was gone. Because usually if you have a problem in a boat, either you see the boat or the kayaker, but not both are missing. So it took them about 7 minutes or so to figure out we were gone. It took them another 7 minutes or so to figure out where we must be. Because as I said earlier, I was under 8 or 10 feet of water, and they couldn't really figure out where I was. Once they figured out where I must be, they started to watch, because obviously time is very important when you're talking about rescue versus recovery. So they started watching from the moment they started the watch to the moment they began CPR was 15 minutes. So I tend to focus on the 15 minutes because that's the shortest objective measure of time without oxygen. And when you look at the physiology of a dying brain, you realize, and I won't get into the details, but basically by 15 minutes, it's over. I wasn't young, the water wasn't cold, there weren't other mitigating factors. By 15 minutes, survival is pretty unlikely. And survival without significant brain damage is really unheard of. And I actually was tested. My kids probably disagree with the outcome, but I did not have apparent brain damage. And so at the end of many months of really data collection and contemplation, and also spending a lot of time meeting with ministers, clergy, because I wanted to know, how do I reconcile my experience with what I had grown up thinking. And I spent many, many months doing that, and at the end had to come to the conclusion that no, what I experienced was real, was true. Just as all of you who have had an experience had to come to that conclusion. Because the world in general will tell you it's not real, and it's not true, and there must be some other explanation. But as you know, and as I know, there isn't a different explanation. And I tried. I tried to come up with a different explanation, partly because I didn't really want the things I've been told to be true. But in the end, I had to conclude that it was true. And so I spent a number of years really thinking about, okay, how do I move forward with this? I didn't want to share my experience with other people because I didn't have time. I didn't have the inclination. I didn't know how to do that. Some of the things I'd been told sort of came to fruition relatively quickly. And then I was also left with this knowledge that my son was going to die. And I have been asked many times, how could you get out of bed with that knowledge? And the answer is very simple, and it comes back again to having made this transformation from hope or faith in the promises of God to a trust. Because if indeed I trust that there is a plan for each person's life that's one of hope, then the same would be true of my son's life. And I woke up every day knowing that, first of all, the plan could change. And certainly I hoped each day that the plan would change. But I also woke up each day knowing that if the plan for his life did not change, that there would be incredible hope and beauty that came not only out of my son's life, but out of his death. In addition to which, if you truly believe that there is life after death, then it changes your experience of death. Because, you know, we have work to do here, but our time here is this incredible opportunity that's so short. And then we transition on, and death is not the final word. And so I spent 10 years sort of in this kind of state of limbo. I really didn't want to do much about it. And I came up with all these reasons why I didn't need to share my experiences with other people. Some of which I feel were legitimate. And I didn't want my kids to know that I didn't want to come back. And I think that that's an important part of almost everyone's near-death experience. None of us want to come back. And so I had good excuses for not doing it. But eventually, I was almost physically picked up out of bed, put on the ground, and it was as though God said, okay, today is the day that you are going to say yes. And I have often said that that's the second day in my life when things changed radically, because on that day I did say yes. And that's an important part of it. You know, it's easy to give lip service to trusting, and yes, I'm listening to where God's leading, but it's very different, and it's a very different thing to say yes. I find that most of us are much happier to say no, because God leads us places where we may not want to go, or don't think that we can go. I mean, rarely is it within our comfort zone. You know, God doesn't usually say, hey, you know what, you're doing great, you're so happy in what you're doing, keep doing it. Because none of us grow or change or learn anything when we're in the status quo. We learn, we grow, we change, we develop when we're stressed in whatever way. We're given all sorts of challenges. And so the second day my life changed was when I got it. I said, okay, yes, I will listen and I will say yes. So I got up, and over the course of about a week, I wrote the manuscript for this book. And the day I finished it, the day I hit the save button, and I thought, oh, it's done. I mean, this was 10 years of feeling guilty that, oh my gosh, I have to do this, and I don't want to do it. And oh my gosh, the elation, the lightness of being when I finished it was indescribable. Allowed me to again remember everything that had been told to me and recall the entire process and all the discussions about trust. Because what it really required was trust. And what it really required later on was the trust to say, here is my son. He's your son. And I will tell you that it is that transformation that motivates me to talk to people. Because I believe that that is truly the absolute key to living a life filled with joy no matter what the circumstances. You know, happiness is like love. It's an emotion. Sometimes you're really happy, sometimes you're sad. You know, sometimes I really love my husband and sometimes I want to kill him. You know, I mean, it's an emotion, and emotions are based on circumstance. But joy is a very different thing. And I believe it's that transformation from hope or faith that the promises of God are true to an absolute trust that they're true that changes everything. And trust, I believe, is a choice. It is a decision. Hope and faith, it's not really, I don't really think that's a choice. I mean, you hear my story, you hear other people's stories, and you kind of hope it's true. I mean, maybe you go through life and you sort of see things happen and you have faith that, yeah, okay, I'm pretty sure it's true. But then something happens and your faith is shaken because you're saying, well, why? Why did my brother-in-law die as a young man? And so then you say, well, I'm pretty angry. I'm like, why did that happen? But when your faith is shaken, I would say that it's because you've never made that transformation. You know, we're all going to die, obviously, and we are all going to suffer loss. We are all going to suffer challenge. And while I don't ask for more challenges, I mean, I don't want more. And I always hate to say this out loud, but I kind of embrace challenges because I am grateful for those challenges, because I am grateful for the way those challenges are changing me and deepening whatever aspect is important at that time, whether it's humility, compassion, and on down the list. And I can be grateful because of that trust. And I absolutely believe that everyone is able to make that transformation. If you've had a near-death experience, it's a lot easier because you already have that absolute understanding that life is not the final word. But I absolutely believe that anyone can make that transformation, but it takes effort. I think it takes collecting data. And it's a matter of usually writing things down. I mean, maybe other people have better memories than I do, but usually it's writing things down and it's looking retrospectively at events in your life and how you came to those events. It's looking at things in your life that maybe your knee-jerk response is, oh, that was terrible. But then looking at it differently and trying to look at the incredible things that came out of that event. In 1,000 years, I would never have looked at my parents' divorce and thought, oh, hey, this is going to be great. I was a young teenager. It was devastating. And at the time, I thought God was, well, I won't use the language that I used at the time, but I was angry. I was a very angry person because it didn't fall in line with what I thought should happen. And it took many years for me to then look back at that event and be so incredibly grateful Because without that, my stepfather wouldn't have come into my life. And he to date, don't tell my husband, but he to date has been the greatest influence on my life of any human being. And so you can look back at your life and you can look at events like that. And they occur in every person's life. You can look at the way God has led you. You can look at the way God has loved you. You can look at the miracles that have occurred. And I absolutely believe miracles occur in every person's life. It's a matter of whether we acknowledge them. Where every time you find yourself going, oh, that's weird, you should flip it and say, huh, is it weird? Or is it a miracle? I mean, there's so many synchronous events that occur, and we can either look up and notice them or not, and it's a choice. And I believe you have to collect all that data, and it has to be in your own life. You can't take my life or anyone else's life, because that's external. And you can say, oh, that's really nice. You could walk out of here today and say, well, yeah, I believe her, because some of it was sort of like my experience. But what I would really hope is you walk out and you say, well, I don't believe her. Because I would hope that you say, well, I'm going to see if that's really true. And spend the next 6 months actually writing things down and thinking about it. Because I believe that at the end of that data collection, you will come to the same conclusion for yourself that I have in my life, which is, yeah, there's enough evidence that I'm willing to make a decision to trust. And the question I have, you know, with spiritual stuff, we all want more and more proof. I mean, there are scientific studies now, but no one can prove spiritual things. Just like you can't prove cold. Cold is really just, or I mean, cold. Cold is the absence of heat. You can't prove cold. You can't, I don't believe, ever prove spiritual things. And if you could, well, it sort of defeats one of the powerful aspects of choosing to believe. But I believe that you can collect the data and you make a choice. And then that is a daily choice. You wake up every day and you say, yes, I trust. I choose to trust. And I believe that you, like I, will then wake up every day. I wake up with the expectation of seeing God's love, seeing God's presence. I wake up with the expectation of seeing miracles in the world. And I do. I think many of you do. I think many of you are, you know, this is a very different group. We are a very different group of people than the usual group of people. I mean, some of you see a lot of things. But I absolutely think that that is the absolutely essential action to take, decision to make, in order to truly transform your life into one of hope, healing, and the purpose of this conference. And I could go on, but I told you I want to leave plenty of time for questions, and I do. And so, who's going to be first? Yes.